Welcome to Daily Bible Study. We're so glad that you decided to join us on this Monday. Our chapters today were 2 Chronicles 31, 32, and 33, but I'm kind of going to use the main storyline in chapter 30 to help illustrate, because it kind of contextually goes together in those four chapters. But in this scene, we see Hezekiah kind of celebrating the Passover, which is something that hadn't been done at this point, probably in about 320 years from the time of Samuel. Now, it wasn't a fully, completely celebrated Passover. We know in a few chapters later, in chapter 35, Josiah actually institutes the Passover, which officially was a practice that was again restarted. But in this moment, you see Hezekiah doing this. Now, the reason I bring this up and the reason why it's important for us is because we have to ask ourselves a question, and I think that question will help lead us tonight as we go through this. And the question is, how long does God's grace abound in our lives? Now that seems like a trick question, right? Because the simple answer is, well, His grace abounds forever, right? He is gracious, that we will never outuse or outspend His grace in our lives. We also have to recognize that God often in the Old Testament gave people what they wanted. And so even as we see this portrayal laying out in Hezekiah's reign, and then from him to Manasseh, and then to Ammon, and then to Josiah, you see moments of greatness, and you see moments of rejection. But in all those moments, I think the biggest thing for us to remember is the heart of the people. Now, Hezekiah did a lot of good things in this moment of organizing the priest, and God delivered them from the Assyrian invasion, right? But then we see pride starting to well up, right? And Manasseh takes over, does evil things, but then eventually repents. But there's still consequences of those actions. And then Ammon comes in and did even more evil, and he dies 2 years after his reign. And then Josiah comes in, they find the book of the law, right? The Deuteronomy, probably, of the Torah. And they read it, right? So all this connects us to this reality of answering this question: how much does God's grace abound in our lives? Well, the most important thing for us to understand is we don't want to find out how far we can push His grace in our lives. Because there's examples in the Old Testament where His people just repeatedly rejected Him. Even in practicing the Passover and celebrating the Passover, as an example, they repeatedly rejected Him. The last thing we want to do is to push the limits of God's grace. None of us deserve salvation. None of us want to walk in that of what we deserve, right? The lane in which we deserve. But we all have to recognize we have to give an account for our actions, right? And if our hearts repeatedly reject the Lord, then we find ourselves in a difficult spot. So I hope that encourages you, even though it's kind of a weighty question. I think the simple answer for us tonight is that God's grace abounds in our lives, and we should rejoice in that. But we should not abuse His grace. We should not abuse His kindness. We should cling to Him and seek Him more in our lives. And I hope that that's what you receive today from our readings.